Neelam Khaki, and I work for API Chaya, which is a Seattle-based nonprofit that serves survivors of gender-based violence, which means domestic violence, sexual abuse, and human trafficking. I've been working with this agency since 2013. Some of the common mental health issues that I see within my work is largely related to a history of trauma within the survivors that I serve. Many of them have been in abusive relationships for quite a number of years, and so they do display signs of trauma and depression in some cases. Sometimes I also work with the children who are present in such situations. The main treatment that we offer at API Chaya would be via our therapists. We have several therapists on staff, including a youth advocate. And so that would entail mainly talk therapy, where the clients come in on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis to talk through their trauma and the history of abuse and think about ways in which to address that. So that also includes some form of personal development. So for instance, if there's a client who is triggered by certain situations because of the trauma that they've experienced, then one method could be for them to be able to identify what those triggers are and think about ways in which to manage them when they happen in the future. In terms of how effective those methods are, often it is something that's self-reported by the clients, and it can take some time for them to get used to putting into place these interventions and reframing their trauma in a way that they feel that they are in control of it rather than it controlling them. Sometimes we also see symptoms of depression within our clients, and even if it's not a clinical diagnosis, there are definitely certain things that we can look out for that show that the client is feeling depressed over a period of time. So, for example, if the client's mood is low or if they're withdrawn from their regular activities, perhaps they're not seeing their friends as much. It could also be things like them sleeping excessively or not at all. Similarly with eating, perhaps their appetite has shrunk, or at the opposite end of the scale, maybe they're overeating. So all of these can indicate, a change in their mental state. And so, one of the treatments for this is for them to have perhaps a checklist of such symptoms, and every couple of weeks to refer to it and think about, where they're falling on that scale. And if it's something that they frequently experience, so for instance, if they haven't slept well in the last, for the majority of time in the last couple of weeks, then that could be a red flag there or an alarm to say that they need to look into that a bit more. Another big symptom is when they wake up, they just don't feel in the mood to do anything. They have no motivation, sometimes even to shower or to do the most basic of things. Sometimes even their spirituality can be impacted. So perhaps they don't feel like praying anymore. And so all of these things are signs that some support could be useful to them. And again, these things can be recognized during the early stages. As I mentioned, it's always a good practice to just keep in mind that checklist and think about, what a person is being impacted by those symptoms. In my career, I have not come across people suffering from psychotic disorders in terms of the survivors that I serve personally. However, if there were a case where a survivor reached out to um, us for support, myself or my co-workers, and after doing the preliminary screening and work with them, if it seemed as though they did have a more serious condition, then we would definitely refer them to um, a therapist with in-depth expertise in that area. In terms of the recovery period, it really does vary from one individual to another. Sometimes, an individual may feel that they've recovered after a period of a few months, and for others, it can take up to a year or maybe even more, depending on how long they were within an abusive situation and the level of abuse that they encountered. As far as our agency goes, we usually give it around a year of services before we think about giving the option for a survivor to, for example, volunteer for our agency. We believe in the concept of survivor empowerment and leadership. So once they've completed services with us, and have been out of services for around a year, then we definitely encourage them, if they wish to volunteer with our agency or be involved in some other way that gives them leadership skills and some form of personal development. So as I said, our benchmark is typically around a year. Any advice for people who are seeking mental health support? I would say go for it. Sometimes challenges in our mental and emotional health can be a bit of a taboo subject. Sometimes people feel shame around that or feel that they themselves are to blame. But what I would say is that, this is something that we are seeing more and more of, particularly during these pandemic times. And honestly, there's no reason to feel ashamed. And in fact, it shows strength to be able to seek out the resources and support that you need. Sometimes it can be a bit daunting, or people may be fearful of seeking these services. But many a time, once they actually understand what's involved, they realize that their fears may have been magnified, and they then do come on board and avail themselves to the services that we can offer. So that would be my overriding message. Please don't feel fearful of obtaining the support and assistance that you need, and that it's definitely available out there. Thank you very much.